Hello guys, I hope you're doing well and welcome to my first track breakdown on YouTube. Today we'll be going through my track called Energy, which is coming out at the end of this month on Short Circuit. So let's get inside Ableton.
Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop.
So here we have the full project of the track. So just to give you a bit of a brief background on the track, I was wanting to make a track with an organ sort of melody or organ in it for quite a while. I made this track around about the same time Lockleed's Believe was going around. If you haven't heard that track, check it out because it is sick. Unfortunately, this isn't quite up to the standard of that track, but it's still pretty good. So yeah, I will play the track from this main breakdown to the drop, just so you get an idea of what it's like, and then we'll start working our way through the channels.
You don't think about things like that. You don't think about things like that.
Energy.
You don't think about things like that.
Energy.
So yeah, so it's quite a peak time track, very energetic with the bass and that organ being sort of the lead, just sort of carrying it through. So let's start off with the low end. So we'll go through each individual element and then we'll just go through some sort of arrangement tricks I've used and send and returns and stuff like that to just sort of bring the track to life. So if we start off with the kick and the bass. So I've gone for this 909 style of kick, as you can see from the sampler down there. Just shortened it right up because there's quite a lot of notes in the bass line, so I didn't want it clashing with the bass. I wanted everything to have enough room. With the kick, again, I've just got some drum bus on there. It's really not doing much, but the transient shaper on it is sort of just adding that top click, which is really helping it cut through the mix quite a lot. I then have the Neutron 3 by iZotope. This is like a mixing engineer sort of plugin. It's really good because it's basically got compressors in it, saturators, gates, transient shapers. But my favorite is the Sculptor. What it is just like a dynamic EQ, which has presets for different settings on. So if I just go up here, you can add fullness, add polish, add punch, stuff for bass, guitars, keys, synths, cymbals, different drum hits, so on and so forth. And when you hear what it's doing, it's really just helping and tightening up some of the frequencies within the kick. So this with it on, off, you can just hear it sort of taking away some of that sort of harshness to it and just making it a bit more sort of clear. And then just to sort of enhance what that EQ is doing is I've just put a saturator on here. I've literally got got it doing no drive. This saturator from SSL is really powerful. If I start to bring up the drive, even by 0.2, 0.3, you can really hear it starting to work. So with it just being on 0, I find that's enough. Just the plugin running just gives it enough extra. Next up, I have this V-Comp, which is a compressor from Waves. As I'm sure a lot of you find, especially myself, compression can be a bit of a minefield. If you overdo it, it just sounds terrible. And then sometimes you can just put compressors on there and it's not even doing anything, it's just using up CPU usage. So what I recommend is getting a few good compressors, because the better compressors you have, the better presets are usually on them, and then using the presets in there. So all I've done is just gone for this kick drum preset. I don't think I've changed any of the settings whatsoever, and it is just really helping in tightening up that kick. So after the compression, I've then used a bit of erosion. You don't see many people doing this, but I recently listened to Wheats, his new track called Heads Roll, I believe, or the other one. It's from the same EP. I'll check it out. It's a really good EP. But you can just hear on his kicks, it's got this sort of hiss to it, which I think is from erosion. I've just got it on sine. It's very low and it's on the higher end of the frequencies, as you can see. It's just adding just a tiny bit more pop on that high end, and it's really important for kicks to have that sort of click and that sort of high end to it, because that's what's going to cut through the mix, especially on smaller speakers like phones and stuff like that. You know, you want that sort of high end. It will just cut through and it will just sound lovely in the mix. And then finally, I've just gone through with a bit of an EQ. I've given it a bit of a mid boost and then just taken away some of the highs, which I didn't think was necessary, and a low cut as well. I've cut at 23 here. I've got a lot of notes going on in the bass line, so I didn't need as much sort of sub from that sort of kick. Lastly, I've just got an auto filter. That's just for during the arrangement, and then mono with a gain. Again, mono, just keeping it down the center of the mix. That's where you want your kick to be at all time. And then the gain is just, again, automation throughout the track. And that is the basics of the kick. I think it sounds really nice and it sits really well within the mix. If there was to change anything, I'd maybe clean up the high end, but when it's all in the track together, sounds decent. So let's now look at the bass line, which is probably the standout point of the track, along with the organ. They're both doing the same melody, so they sort of merge into one when the organ comes in. So it is just an operator respace. This is one I've made myself. If you want to make one yourself, I just recommend searching on YouTube, respace tutorials. Look at drum and bass ones as well. That's what I did to create this. Respaces are common in sort of drum and bass and garage, even breakbeats as well. So there's quite a lot of tutorials on how to make it, but it's just offering a lot of low end power and this rumble in the mid. It just sounds really nice, and then you can automate the filter as well. If I start to bring it up, you know, it's very powerful. So let's just re-enable that. So all I've done for this one is I have reduced the release, because as you can see, if I go into the MIDI, there's a lot of notes going on, so I don't want a lot of release on this bass. I want it to be short and snappy, so nothing's overlapping and it's just quick and sharp, which really helps nicely within the groove of the track. Going through sort of plugins, again, so I've just got overdrive and chorus. This is part of the bass preset itself, which is creating that sound. The overdrive is just giving it that real sort of mid crunch and power, and the chorus is sort of just detuning it. and giving it a tiny bit of width, but then I will bring that back in by using a utility. Then I've just gone through the auto filter before, and then next up on the chain is this V-Comp again by Waves. I have just gone for another preset. It's important to note the difference between compression on sort of samples and stuff you like VSTs that aren't processed. So when you're using samples like kicks, claps, hi-hats, especially from packs, more than likely they've already been compressed, saturated, fiddled with, so they sound good to start with. That's the point in them. You know, there's an engineer there making these samples to sound as good as possible. So that's why sometimes they don't need much processing. When it comes to VSTs or plugins, you know, they haven't been fiddled with as much. So this is where you can get away with more processing. So this is why I'd always sort of compress the bass. It's just controlling those dynamics. Some people really squash the bass. I don't like it. I like my bass to have a bit of movement. I really think it helps with the groove. But for this one, it is fairly squashed if you listen to it. You can tell there's not much dynamic range, so where the frequencies are bouncing off each other, there's not much movement. Again, it works well for this track because that's what the organ's doing. If I just play this with the organ now. You can see that organ's, that's doing the movement, that's got the dynamic range. So for this track, that compressor worked well. I've then got a Pro Q on it. So I've cut at 20 here, sort of below 20 it's just sort of rumble and unnecessary noise that you don't want in your track. I've done a cut around the 200 mark. This is probably where the fundamental of the kick was coming through. So that sort of cut is allowing that kick just to really pop through. You know, this sort of 100 to 200 range, there can be a lot of mud and a lot of issues because that's where you're sort of blending from low end to sort of mid to high. So that's where your bass and sort of drums are starting to clash over in a frequency spectrum. So this is just helping give it some room so there isn't as much clashing going on. I've given it a little boost there in this sort of 500 range. That's just again helping that sort of mid power come through of the track. And then a couple more things I've just got on the chain. Next is R-Bass. R-Bass is really good for just adding some low end power to your track. I pretty much use it on every single track I've made recently since I've got these Waves bundle. It's really important to understand how to use it because it can be a bit intense and just ruin your low end. So the best way to do it is have an EQ at the ready and just sort of look to see maybe where you could get away with adding some more low end power. So if we look, this sort of 20 to sort of 50 range, that's popping. 50 to 100, or there's a little bit here in this sort of 80 to 100 range where I could just get a little bit more oomph out of it. So that's why I've gone for 82, and then you just bring the intensity up or down as much as you desire and it sounds good. So if we just do a little before and after. You can really hear it's just giving it a bit more power, which is really nice. I've then just got a sidechain plugin on it. This one's One Knob Pumper. It's really quite powerful. There's this and Kickstart that I would recommend. I sort of dot between the two of them depending on really just whatever I fancy. But yeah, that one's doing a lot just to help sidechain it to that kick on the 4/4 beat. And then finally, I've got a utility. I've put it in bass mono. So now this is a technique I use quite a lot within my tracks, is I put it in bass mono. So these sort of sub frequencies, so you've still got the EQ up here, we can sort of see it. So where my mouse is and below, all of this is sort of straight down the center, which is where we want these sub frequencies. above this, I've just added a bit of width to the bass. And if you're listening in headphones like I am, you can just hear just filling out just your ears a bit more. Just that stereo spectrum is just filling it out. And in the mix, it just helps gel everything together. It seems less rigid of kick, bass, and clap down the center, then hats a bit wider, percussion out, and then synths on the side. It just helps it gel everything together and make it sound more cohesive. So I do that a lot in my tracks. That's probably something that creates my sound. But yeah, it's something definitely to play around with. So that's the low end overall. So then if we start looking at some of the other elements, so going through the drums. So the clap, again, nothing crazy. I've stacked 3 different claps on top of each other. So let's have a look at what they are doing. This one's just more of sort of a transient. I think it's just helping cut this clap through the mix. This is definitely down the central, and it's probably just adding some body to the clap overall. We next then have a 909 clap from my drum machine, my Roland TR8S. This one, as you can hear, it's quite thin, so that's why these other 2 claps are definitely filling out and giving this clap the body and sort of attack which is cutting through the mix. But you can tell that's coming from a drum machine, because if you listen closely, sort of the pitch of the clap changes on every other clap. Plug-in wise on this one, I've got a Peds S22. It's from Waves again. All it is a stereo width plugin. It's really easy to use, this one. So basically there's your frequencies there that you're widening. So you can create this really nice effect of where your sort of lower frequencies are still central, and then your higher frequencies are coming more out in the stereo field. So let's have a look at what processing we have got on here. Nothing crazy again. We've got some saturation, which is just helping gel these 3 claps together. And similarly with the compressor, I probably wouldn't use the compressor if I'm just using 1 or 2 samples, but because I've got quite varied claps in here, the compressor, again, it's just helping squash them together, making them sound more cohesive. Pro Q3, nothing fancy on it. I've just cutting off a bit of the high end that I don't need. Cutting off at 100. Some people may cut higher. I like my claps to have a bit of body in them. We have got so far the low end and the clap. We'll go on to the closed hats next. Let's just get it on a section to loop. There we go. So the hats for this track, I've used a variation of sort of 808 and 606 and eventually 909 samples. This is the core of my of all my tracks are these sort of 808 and 606 drums, and depending on the style of track I will use 909s and stuff like that. But I just really love the short decay, the crispness that they offer. And if you've heard them in clubs and stuff like that, just a track where you've just got a straight 808 on the offbeat, it's just so clean and it really cuts through. So it's all in drum rack, all made by MIDI, which is more often than not what I do. For this one, it looks like I've just collected a bunch of different sort of 808 and 606 sounds. What I usually have in my user library, and I recommend everyone to do this, is pre-made racks with all your favourite drum hits, percussion, rides, whatever. Have them all in racks already done up. It just saves so much time. And again, it can create familiarity in your tracks if you're using very similar samples. So that's what I've done in here. And the rhythm is pretty straightforward. So we've got 2 hi-hats on sort of 8th repeat, so that's on beat and off beat. I've got these heavily side chained, so they're just sort of ducking out the way of the kick. This is my main hat here, which is really nice. It's really clean, really sharp, and really cuts through the mix, even with that sort of heavy bass line. And then I've just got a few hats just adding groove, and nothing crazy here. I do pretty much all of this on my Ableton Push. Personally, I just find I can add more rhythm by playing stuff in by hand and then quantizing it than sitting here and doing it with a keyboard and mouse. Again, it's just, for me, it's adding that human sort of element to it. But that's personal preference. It works for me, it may not work for you. So let's have a look now at the 909. So this has come from my TI-8S again. If I just play this one by itself, you can hear it's just gating where these closed hats are coming in if I play them together. Just the sound quality that comes from that machine, it's just unbeaten, I think. It's expensive, it's a pain in the ass to set up, but just can't beat a decent 909 hat groove. Nothing fancy going on with the processing here. In fact, I've got nothing on that channel. Here we have Stereo Savage, so I'm just pushing that closed hat out in the mix slightly. Effects Rack doing Decapitator. It's very, 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 very good. I'd recommend everyone to get this plugin or get the Effects Rack. So I've just changed it to E. These are just different presets emulating different styles of distortion units. Personally, I always use E. That's what I see majority of producers use. And then the dark and the bright feature in the plugin sort of just bringing it to dark always does wonders. I think it just really dulls down the sound and just makes it sound more raw and authentic. Definitely bright can be used if you've got a dull sample that needs brightening up, but for me that sort of dark, bringing it down very slightly, always works wonders on these sort of 909 samples. So jumping in to the 909 hat, so the main hat, all I've got is a utility. This is again just for automation. The Effects Rack, Decapitator, just as a Bean Over, doing exactly the same thing. And a Pro Q3, again, I'm cutting at 100. I could probably get away with cutting at 200, but like I went over, sometimes these sort of rawness just adds to your track, adds to the life of it. And we've just taken out some of these real nasty resonances. That one could be tightened up a little bit, like so. And yeah, it sounds really nice. I've combined the sample that I got from my drum machine with just a normal sort of 909 sample. I think it's an East End Dub one. Yeah, East End Dub one. Sick pack if you haven't checked that out. And that's just again helping add some body to the hat. So what else have we not been over? Oh, and I just missed this, which is very simple, nothing fancy. It's just a top loop. I would recommend using top loops in tracks. There's a reason why people make these sample packs. It's to enhance your music. Don't rely on them, but it makes such a difference to the overall groove. It's something I ignored when I first started making music. I always thought, got to program it in by MIDI. It's got to be your own, like, or else you're not being creative. But you can still be creative and use loops. They're there for a reason. And just to prove my point, without that top loop, it just fills it out. It's adding to the groove, it's filling out that body of those hats in general. And it sounds sick. So that's pretty much all the drums, I believe, if we play them all together. with the low end. You can really see how that 909 hat is adding so much energy to the track. Next up is percussion, which there's hardly anything going on in this track. Revisiting it now, I'm actually really surprised at how little percussion there is in it, considering the majority of my tracks now have well over 10 tracks of percussion in it. But anyway, we just listen to it by itself. There's still plenty going on, even though there is only effectively 2 channels in total. Because the other channel is this clave, or clav. Never too sure how to pronounce that one. And then we sort of got this zap here, which I'm then running through one of my send and return effects, which I will get to eventually. Again, I'm using a combination of drum racks and the slice effect in the sampler in Ableton. I do this a lot, in fact probably too much, but it's a really good way of making a loop your own. So you're using the sounds that the loop has to offer, but I'm humanizing it and making it my own by playing it in on my Ableton Push. So let's just go through this one here, which is for slice. There you go. So you can see how that is my own pattern. And if we listen to the original loop, so there you go. So that's the original loop. And then that's my loop. So I'm using the same sounds, I'm just making that fit into my groove. So just to show you exactly what I mean, if I play the drums, you can hear how where I've placed those MIDI notes from playing them in on my Ableton Push, it fits well within the groove. Now if I just drop the loop on an audio channel, copy it across, turn off this one and just turn it down a little bit. See how that just totally ruins the vibe and sort of that groove that I've already created in my drums. So that's why I always recommend using the slice feature within Ableton. So the next channel is, again, another drum rack. These are just a bunch of different sort of sounds I've collected over time. And again, it's just playing rhythm. That's going to work well within my groove. So let's have a look at this. There we go. So it's just a zap. It's nothing fancy. It doesn't hit very often. But what's creating that delayed effect and sort of the movement is this effect right here, which is a crystallizer. I use this send and return all the time. It's basically a delay or an echo, whatever you prefer to call it, with a sort of pitch modulation as well. It just, what it can do is sick. I mean, it sort of says it there, granular echo synthesizer. God knows what it actually does inside there. But there's plenty of presets to choose from. I like the default one, but I mean, you can see how many there is there on the screen. So I just usually use default on one send and return, and then more recently on my recent tracks I'll have another one and I'll find a different preset, and then I'll actually chain it together with some of these other effects. So maybe I will do a pan, a phase, and then like a filter, because some of the effects you can get from this crystallizer are mental. So yeah, that is just a percussion group. I don't really need to go over that clav. It is what it is. It's dead simple. Just add into the groove, add into that high end, and it's cutting through the mix nicely. So with everything else, and that is pretty much the core of the track. Everything else are just sort of vocal hits and obviously the organ, which we'll go through next. So the organ is 2 different organs, both from Analog Lab, I believe, which is the Arturia center of sort of presets. If you haven't got the Arturia stuff, I highly recommend it because there's plenty of synthesizers in there in the bundle. And then you have this Analog Lab, which makes it so easy just to find really interesting presets. So let's just delve into this one, because the organ's quite interesting, because by itself it actually sounds pretty bad. There's a lot of quite rough frequencies in there, I'd say so myself, but I think that's what adds to the character of it. So this is something, a take-home message I always like talk about, is if it sounds good in the mix, don't worry about it sounding perfect when soloed. When it's in the mix, you can't notice these sort of like horrible sort of frequencies that we can hear with it just soloed. When it's in the mix, it sounds powerful, it sounds punchy, it's catchy, bright, and it's colourful. It sounds really nice. But yeah, by itself it sounds a bit rough. But all it is 2 different ones. I've got this more sort of classic sort of church organ. It's probably even from, yeah, so jazz organ. And that's what's sort of giving like the body and that sort of attack to the organ itself, the sound as a whole. Nothing fancy on the processing, just compressor, which is probably helping with that attack. I don't know what's there, should be there. Adding some whip to it, taking out the low end. Again, I'm not doing anything fancy with the EQ, I don't think. I am taking away through some of the frequencies with the Pro Q3. So I'm using quite a lot of dynamic EQs. If you don't know how to do this within the plugin, I'll just create one here. Go up to the little arrow and go make dynamic. This then, it does it itself. You don't need to set up any settings or anything like that. It's just knocking away those frequencies when they come in too much. You can see what it's doing just there. I find this still allows for that sort of character that these frequencies are offering, but it's getting rid of some of that harsh resonance that it is coming with that sort of sound. So yeah, so that's that organ. And then we go on to the other one, which is probably, I'd say, like a bit more of a digital one, which is sort of helping it fit better into this track. It sounds quite FM, which is a sound design technique that I really like, and I often reach for FM synthesizers. So let's have a look what sound. So yeah, I think that is an emulation of the Mini Moog. I'm not too sure. But again, nothing fancy on the processing, just compressing. Probably taking out some resonances again. Yeah, add in some highs just to try and get it to cut through again. side chain, some saturation to hold them all together. And then last on the chain are these stereo width plugins. Well, one's a stereo width and one's a chorus. Chorus will widen the sound, but I'm using the Juno chorus. So this is a sort of emulation, or not even an emulation, it is the chorus found in the Juno from Roland. I really like the sound this one offers. Again, it just helps offer that raw sort of more analog sound, which is something I really try to achieve within my tracks. I am following sort of modern trends with these sort of glitchy percussion sounds, but I try and get that sort of analog warmth and colour to try and stand out from everyone else. And that is pretty much the whole track and the whole groove. There's a few other little things that I'm sure we'll go through when we just go over the arrangement quickly. But that is pretty much it. The only thing I haven't touched on is actually the melody. So both, as I've mentioned earlier, both the organ and the bass follow the exact same melody. The melody, I would love to say I actually created it, but I didn't. I used a plugin called Sting. If I just search it up here to show you what it is. Just pop it on this M1. So you can see it's an acid generator plugin. It's basically just a sequencer, but it's mainly used for acid patterns. I often reach for this plugin when I'm really struggling on a direction for the track or a melody. You know, if you just play the beats of a track by itself, it's still quite hard to see where the direction and sound of this track's going to go. A lot of the times, especially nowadays, my track will be so full at that stage. When I come to write a bass line, I can sort of hum one out. But for this track, I couldn't. So that's why I reached for that plugin. And thankfully, it's done me some massive favours. And all I did was change some of the positioning of the notes around. And that was it. I was set. So I hope you guys enjoyed that track breakdown. Please drop some comments below on what you learn, any take-home messages, and any improvements as well in the way I presented myself. YouTube is a platform I'm looking to pursue quite regularly. I'm hoping to do once a week, maybe once every other week. We'll see how long it takes me to edit and create stuff. But yeah, thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you want to download the track, Energy is out on Short Circuit at the end of March. You can always head to my Instagram page to check out new content, quick and helpful tutorials, and some unreleased tracks that will be coming out throughout the year. Cheers for watching, guys.